Welcome to Greenwood's Legal's festive Employment Law Nowcast. This is the one about Christmas parties. Enjoy the podcast. Hello and welcome to a very special festive edition of our podcast. We're very excited and I'm joined again today by John Macaulay and Keith Williams. In this episode, we are going to be discussing work parties, and as it's a festive season, that would normally be festive work Christmas parties. So am I right in thinking that these types of parties that employers will usually be planning at this type of year, are they work events?
Usually they are, and it sometimes catches employers by surprise, and they think about work being things that happen in the workplace rather than things that are happening outside of work. But where you've got something going on that has got a real close connection to work, then there is a real chance that it will be work. So typically where you've got some sort of Christmas party, for example, the employer will be paying for the venue. It might give people a bit of time off so they can get to the party beforehand. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Clink.
Ooh, clink. And putting other things in place, other mechanisms in place, it is very likely that it's going to be treated as a work event for legal purposes in the same way as it would if it was something going on in the office or the factory floor.
And I can immediately see some pitfalls with that. Maybe I'm too quick to put my lawyer hat on as opposed to the festive one. But yeah, I can immediately see some pitfalls with that. So what do we think are the kind of things that could happen if maybe things start to go wrong?
I think the first point is around what events you're actually planning, trying to make sure that you bear in mind that, for example, if it's a Christmas party, not everybody will celebrate Christmas. You need to be aware of different religious views, the kind of environment at the party as well. So not everybody will want to drink alcohol. There may be some people who will want to have alcohol-free alternatives. Certain types of food may not be appropriate for people of particular religious beliefs. So I think the starting point is about kind of making sure you're thinking about inclusion. So I think that's in the planning. And then I guess also about trying to make sure your rules are really clear in terms of what sort of behaviour is expected. And I guess that brings into play the point about if it is a social event that's effectively built around alcohol, what are the rules there? What are the expectations? Should the expectations be any lower on the basis that the company is effectively providing, for example, a free bar or things like that? So that calls into question the standards of behaviour and making sure that you're clear about them before you start.
Yeah, so in that sort of circumstance where free bar is being provided, I suppose an employee might say, well, I was positively encouraged to get drunk.
Yeah, and there's case law around situations where, for example, where there's a free bar and then there were a number of employees who got drunk, behaved inappropriately, kind of loud, that kind of thing, and they were then disciplined and they were found to have been unfairly dismissed. And one of the factors was the issue that it was a free bar, people were being encouraged to drink. So effectively, the tribunal were kind of saying you can't necessarily expect the same standard of behaviour if you're encouraging people to get drunk, and presumably if you haven't set very clear standards beforehand.
And I suppose if you have set those clear standards, but they fall below it, I suppose employers could be concerned about the risk of complaints of harassment, that kind of thing. I know there's been an a government consultation recently about further protections for workers against harassment and particularly third-party harassment. There was a lot in the media at the time about whether that was potentially risking employers having to become the banter police. And we've heard recently that actually the regulations that will come into force have been watered down slightly. So now there is a duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent harassment in the workplace. So in terms of the regulations themselves, maybe not too much of a change, but obviously it is a really important consideration for these types of events, especially if they are quite clearly work events.
Yeah, I think that's right because, as you say, the what we thought we were going to get in terms of protection from harassment, that has been hugely watered down, and there is going to be a bit of a change, but not much of a change. So we are where we always were, I think, and that's around employers being responsible for their employees' conduct during work events as well as actually in the workplace. I remember, and the world has moved on a little bit now, but regular as clockwork in years gone by. On my first day back in the office after the Christmas break, a particular client I was bound to get a phone call from saying, right, we had our Christmas party on Christmas Eve or a couple of days before, and it turns out that these things happened, and some quite disturbing and distressing events would have happened at those Christmas parties, and then there was the aftermath, the clearing up the mess from the Christmas party in a work sense, and employees having done various things to other employees that then there were complaints about. So it can be a real issue for employers especially if those ground rules haven't been set in the first place, and people can point and say, well, I wasn't made aware of any expectations over my conduct.
And so can we think of any examples then of, other than the setting of the ground rules, of other kind of preventative steps that employers could take while they're in the planning phases of a party or a gathering to try and make sure as much as possible that these issues don't arise? I mean, training potentially could be one, maybe not necessarily the week before saying this is training specifically on how you must and must not behave at the party, but as a wider piece about expectations of behaviour in the workplace. But anything else?
I suppose back to the point about reasonable steps to prevent harassment, then more general training that you might do throughout the year to make sure that people are aware of what behaviour is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and hopefully then that will carry through to whatever social events, whether it's a Christmas party or something else. I think it probably does need something specific, some specific communication about those social events, because the fact is they may well be work, as Keith has said, but they're not the same as work. People are being encouraged to relax, potentially to have a drink, all of that kind of thing. So it's kind of saying we're stepping outside the normal boundaries of what you would expect in the office, but there are still standards that are required. So setting those boundaries, I think just having a think about some of the other issues that might arise. There's been some interesting case law about people having, for example, work-related conversations during a social event. So managers talking to their direct reports about potential salary increases or promotions. I would have thought fairly obviously that might not be the best place to do that. People then arguing that they were promised a particular salary level within a period of time at the Christmas party, and that doesn't happen, and then they bring a claim and are actually successful. So kind of being aware of when kind of formal work type conversations are not really appropriate. I've also seen suggestions of having sort of almost like kind of chaperone type people who are required to remain sober and kind of watch what's going on and make sure that they're available should anything go wrong or diffuse situations. Things like that you can consider. So I think there's all sorts of things that you might have a think about. I suppose the other one is just thinking about absences, particularly absences, if somebody's in late the day after, is that going to be permitted? What you wouldn't want is a situation where a number of people come in late, one of them's disciplined and several others aren't, and you then get into issues of inconsistent treatment or possibly even discrimination. So just trying to have a clear idea of what the issues are and how you might tackle them in advance, I think, is the key.
Yeah, I think that's all really interesting and helpful. I suppose a kind of offshoot is we're quite clear that the kind of standard work party that's put on by the employer, paid for by the employer, the times given to have off by the employer are very, very likely to be categorised as working time. But what if there's an offshoot after the party, if there's an after party? I think it's very fact specific as to whether any sort of after party would also be classed as work, and it would depend on things like who was present at the after party, who was, maybe if there is drinking, who was buying the drinks, and the communications around that. But have we got any thoughts about those generally?
Well, yeah, I've certainly. It's a question that I've been asked by clients
Yeah.
before. So it's, as you say, the official work party is one thing, but then are they responsible for everything that happens on the night, even when things perhaps go a little bit off piste, and people leave the main party and go off on a quest of their own to continue the party. John, I think we've talked before about some case law that you've been looking into about that, haven't we?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, Micheala, the question of whether a sort of after party would be connected with work, I think, is very fact specific. But there was one particular case, I think it was around 2011, and it was quite a shocking, quite a serious case where I think it was a managing director who, following a Christmas party, a number of employees went back to a hotel. There were sort of additional drinks, and there was then an argument, and the managing director actually caused quite serious brain damage to one of the employees who was at the this sort of after party. And the question was, because it wasn't actually at the Christmas party itself, it was at something afterwards, was that sufficiently connected with work? And the court looked at a variety of factors. So they looked at the fact that it wasn't actually the Christmas party, but the company paid for the taxis to take the little group of people that went back to the hotel. They also paid for the drinks at the hotel. But one of the key factors, and it's important to note that the High Court actually decided that it wasn't connected with work, so the company wasn't liable for the managing director's actions. But the Court of Appeal overturned that, and they said that one of the things that happened at this after party was the managing director was kind of talking about his position in the company, and they said he was wearing his, I think they said, metaphorical director's hat at the point that he was doing all of this, and therefore they felt it was connected. So it was interesting. They just analysed all these various different things, and felt that although it wasn't the Christmas party itself, was sufficiently connected, and obviously it was pretty serious in terms of the harm that had been done to this employee. So I think you've just got to look at all the particular facts of any specific case that you're dealing with.
As you've said, it is really serious. Potentially, if employers get it wrong, and I know we've been discussing some of the alternatives maybe that might be available to employers if they decide that a kind of more traditional alcohol-fueled party is no longer right for them. I've been looking at some statistics, I think released by the NHS fairly recently in the last few years, which has found that the younger members of the population, kind of the 16 to 24 age group and the 25 to 34 age group, are actually now the least likely to drink at all. And there's been a real increase, I think, and we will have seen it in supermarkets and things, in the variety and the amount of low alcohol or alcohol-free options available to purchase in supermarkets and in places like pubs. So maybe one option, if an employer decides maybe culturally that an alcohol-fueled party is not right for them, maybe an option would be to have it in a more neutral venue, somewhere that's not a bar maybe, and serve up something that is that is alcohol free, either as an option or as the only option. And now's probably a good time to say you've probably noticed that we are having a drink today. It's in the morning, but this is alcohol free. This is no secco, and then that led us on to a conversation about is this okay? We're all going to be going back to our desks after we've filmed this, and there isn't any alcohol in the bottle that John opened. But when I purchased it earlier in the week, I was on the self-checkout in the supermarket, and the supermarket attendant dealing with the self-checkouts had to confirm that I was over 18 to buy it.
Yeah.
Which, you know...
Yeah, and when I was walking through the office this morning with this bottle of beer, a number of colleagues commented on the fact that, what are you doing with beer at 9 o'clock in the morning? Well, it's alcohol-free beer. If I was walking through with a bottle or a can of Diet Coke, no one would have been commenting about that in the morning. But it's amazing the difference in perception that is caused because these drinks, that bottle of beer, the bottle of apparent prosecco there are deliberately made to look like their alcoholic counterparts. Is it okay for someone to sit at their desk in the office at 10 o'clock in the morning, knocking back a bottle of what looks like beer, but is in fact alcohol free?
And my view is no, generally, because I think it is all about perception. And I think it probably depends on the industry that you're in.
Yeah, I think so.
And Micheala, you gave an example before about if you work in a brewery, then maybe it would be fine to be drinking no alcohol beer while you're working. But I think for us as lawyers, I think if I've got a conference call after this, if I went back to my desk with this and was sipping it while I was giving the advice, I think the client would quite reasonably be, no matter how much I might say, well, it's no alcohol, I think they'd probably be quite concerned. But I think the key is about, again, it's about, I think it's about the expectations, because a lot of the policies that I've seen, I'm not sure I've seen any policies, in fact, which deal with no alcohol drinks. They're all talking about not consuming alcohol, not being under the influence of alcohol while at work, all of that sort of stuff. So theoretically, drinking no or low alcohol, no alcohol drinks would be absolutely fine. So there then is a question of, should policies go further in terms of identifying that? Because I think it's all about perception, and in a lot of cases, the general public, clients, etc., would not be happy in most jobs if they could see you drinking while you were working, even if it is no alcohol.
Yeah, and I think potentially, in answer to your question about the policies covering this kind of thing, potentially yes, because whilst there are lots of industries I can think of where it clearly wouldn't be appropriate, so I don't know, if you were just about to have surgery, for example, and you met your surgeon before and they're drinking a what looks to be a bottle of beer, or you're about to board a flight, or if you are dropping the children off at school and that your child's teacher is there with a glass of Prosecco, clearly not great. But for me, it's that middle ground of maybe people in offices who've got a very relaxed office environment, who do regularly have time out for alcoholic drinks events, and that is acceptable within confines. Why then is why are non-alcoholic drinks not acceptable? Because actually, there's quite a bit of alcohol in some everyday foods that we find, like bananas, bread, because of the way it's made. So why is this not acceptable, strictly speaking? I agree with you about the perception, but is that more important?
And yeah, that's got to be it, isn't it? And you can absolutely see an employee who's never been told it's not acceptable to drink alcohol-free beer at your desk. If they were then pulled up for that and told that what they're doing was inappropriate, you could absolutely see an employee objecting to that and saying, well, explain to me what the difference is between drinking a can of Coke and drinking a bottle of alcohol-free beer. And again, like so many of these things, it's about it's about being ahead of the game, isn't it? And if you've explained to your employees what is and isn't acceptable, and said before it's happened what your thought process is, it's going to be much easier for you to bring your employees along with you, and explain that why you don't feel it's acceptable, and why it won't be tolerated, than if you're trying to deal with it after it's happened, and then you're retrospectively trying to explain why you didn't like something that did happen that you've never mentioned before.
I get probably the nearest example is probably smoking and vaping in
Yeah.
terms of, most employers would have had at one point a no smoking policy, and then obviously as people then turn to vapes, a lot of the time employers have expanded that policy just to make it clear. So I think it is all about clarity of what you expect from your employees. But personally, I think it's perfectly reasonable for employers to say that they don't think it's appropriate for people to consume either alcoholic or non-alcoholic drinks whilst they're working. And as you said, Micheala, it may be that in certain industries, people might take a different view. But then again, it's about just making it clear. Because I think, as I say, if we go to a situation where people were actually allowed to do this, I think you would have a huge amount of backlash in terms of, is it appropriate? Take your point about the teachers. There's other issues, like, for example, is it teaching children, regardless of the person being in charge of the class, is it teaching children inappropriate behaviour because they're seeing an adult during working hours consuming something that looks, for all intents and purposes, like alcohol? So there's all sorts of issues.
Yeah, it's normalising a particular behaviour, isn't it?
So there's certainly a lot of food for thought. I think we'll leave it there for today. But we hope that's been interesting in relation to work parties, and then a potential solution in relation to offering alcohol-free drinks. But then that might cause further considerations as well. And we just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to our podcasts this year.